Blender 4.5 LTS has just been released, and it includes a lot of great quality of life improvements in basically every area. The LTS stands for long-term support, which indicates that it'll get bug fixes for 2 more years. So if you're looking to start a new project and want to stick to the same version throughout, which is always recommended, an LTS release is a smart choice. I'm Jonathan Lampel from cgcookie.com, and in this video, we're going to take a look at everything that's new in Blender 4.5. First up, a new Boolean algorithm called Manifold has been added to the Boolean modifier, geometry nodes, and Sculpt mode. As the name hints at, this option only works on manifold objects, i.e. watertight meshes with no loose geometry and all normals facing outwards. The upside of that limitation is that it's both very fast and very accurate. It's even faster than the old fast method, now called float, and is as precise as the exact method. Just look at how smooth this is. When snapping to the 3D cursor, you can now optionally take into account the cursor's rotation. You'll probably want to snap this to surfaces most of the time, which you can do in the 3D cursor tool by setting it to geometry, or if you like using the Shift right-click hotkey, you can go into your key map preferences, search for 3D cursor, and set that to geometry. If you parent an object to a vertex, you can now explicitly set which vertex without going into edit mode for the other object. And you can choose whether you want to pick the vertex of that index before or after the modifiers have been applied. The separate, split, join, and convert attribute operators are now available in the new curves type edit mode. We also now have statistics for the new curves. Curve and grease pencil dimensions are now listed in the sidebar. On traditional curves, the active spline panel has been moved from the properties editor to the item tab in the sidebar, similar to where you already find info for the active vertex or edge for meshes. The default distance of the retopology overlay now places it at 1 centimeter above surfaces instead of 20 centimeters, which was way too big for most cases. The new point cloud objects are now fully supported and even have their own edit mode. The 3D viewport now shows the object data name in the text overlays. And last but certainly not least, UVs can now be seen in object mode in the UV editor. It even works for multiple objects, and the active object is drawn with more opacity to help it stand out. They're also visible in the image editor in paint mode. Over in Sculpt mode, you can now mask by color from the mask menu. Also, the Draw, Draw Sharp, Plane, and Clay Strips brushes can now respond to pen tilt if your pen supports tilt, and the Clay Strips brush is now about 22% faster. Sculpting performance has improved when using brushes that are small compared to the total object size, which is especially great when sculpting detail on characters. In Weight and Vertex Paint mode, you can now undo property changes like turning on symmetry. Sculpt, Texture, and Vertex Paint modes have new jittering options for randomizing the hue, saturation, or value along the stroke or per stroke. When it comes to brush assets, you can now duplicate them to the current file if you don't want the new one to be added to any of your existing asset libraries and clutter them up. And using node tools is significantly faster in Sculpt mode now, especially when dealing with masks, face sets, or deformations. And now, speaking of node tools, let's hear from Harry what crazy things are new with geometry nodes, and spoiler alert, this update is a big one.
Thanks, Jonathan. You know what? Blender 4.5 does bring us a lot of very exciting updates for geometry nodes. In fact, you could say that it's a boundary-breaking bunch of brilliant innovations, because it's packed with a powerful set of new nodes that broaden our possibilities yet again. And there are so many nodes with changes that if you cram them all into a group, that group would be so big it would be visible from space. Probably. I'm not an astrophysicist, I just do geometry nodes. We will start with something new, set mesh normals. Now we can store edge and mesh sharpness, edit existing tangent space normals, or create normals in the new free format, which can be much faster, what with it just being a simple 3D vector. All of this new normal manipulation has incredible potential. For example, if we create custom normals for this Suzanne, by taking her normals and mixing them with normals sampled from the nearest surface of a second object. Then control the mix's factor with the distance between the two, we can create a smooth transition between the two meshes without changing their topology. Now, you may have noticed that some of your favorites have suddenly got very skinny. Well, the same thing has happened with geometry nodes too. The geometry sockets on nodes like these have been aligned to use the same row. The input nodes have had redundant labels removed and then been gently compressed. And image inputs now have buttons to create or open an image. In fact, all of these nodes have had a zhuzh. The new match string node allows us to search a string for the presence of another string. So, with the help of a switch and a string to curves node, we can confirm that Romeo and Juliet starts with Romeo, that it contains Romeo, but sadly he's not there at the end. The string to curves node, it still outputs each letter as an instance, but now each instance is named after its character. Super useful for debugging in the spreadsheet, and probably helpful for your Wordle skills too. Next, we're moving along to the curve to mesh node, where there's now a scale input to scale the profile curve. This replaces the implicit use of the radius attribute that was used before, allowing us to scale the profile curve directly. But innovations don't just move in the curve to mesh direction, because mesh to curve now has the option of 2 modes, allowing us to choose between the existing behavior, converting each edge into a curve, and this new one that takes each face and converts it into a cyclic curve. And the bounding box node? Well, it's now newly curve sensitive, with a checkbox to include both their radiuses and those of point clouds. We'll bound back to bounds in a minute, but first grease pencil nodes, which now have their own submenu in the Add menu. In it, there's 3 new nodes, and we'll start with the Set Grease Pencil Color node. This does exactly what it says it's going to do, letting us change both the color and opacity of either our strokes or fills. For your more granular selection needs, the layer names in the Named Layer Selection node are now searchable. The other 2 new Grease Pencil nodes are Set Grease Pencil Softness, with which we now have control of the softness attribute, and the Grease Pencil Depth node. With this, we can set the Grease Pencil Depth option as either that of the 2D layers or the 3D location in the scene. But let's be serious. Blender 4.5 isn't all funky new Grease Pencil nodes, it's funky new field nodes too. There's Instance Bounds, which gives us the bounding box dimensions of instances without realizing them, with the option of including their radiuses too. And though in the past operations of the attribute statistic node were only accessible while tethered to a geometry noodle, we can now break free of it with these 3 field input nodes: field average, field min and max, and field variance. And there's a load of new math too. The new bitmath node has a tidy set of bitmath operations. And there's 2 new operations in the vector math node, power and sine. When there are this many operations, I think it's called maths. Next, the new camera info node, which outputs information about the selected camera object. It can be used for camera culling or to generate geometry using the camera's precise point of view, so that you can create effects like this. There's also some tight geometry node interface updates designed to improve our noding experience. For example, you know how the position socket on the set position node defaults to the position field if you don't plug anything into it? Well, now if I create a new group around that node, it will set a default behavior for the new group's position input based on the behavior of that socket. And previously, unused sockets were just grayed out. But now, if a socket is unused because of a menu input, that socket is then hidden. Oh, and if you want to time out and tap some beats, you can now expand your menus into buttons. And while we are minding our menus, menus can now control other menus. I'm not being weird, but this could escalate really quickly. Finally, we come to what is quite possibly the most consequential of 4.5's geometry node updates. 6 new nodes for importing 6 types of external data. And we can even drag and drop the files into the geometry node editor to automatically create the corresponding import node. The new format string node formats values into a string using either a Python-compatible string format or Blender's syntax. With it, we can combine and format values in a super neat way, something especially useful for importing sequences of files. And if you're a heavy viewer node user like me, you'll be pleased to hear that it now supports shortcuts. Control and the number sets a shortcut. Then simply press the number to activate it. So that's getting things into geometry nodes. What about getting things out? Well, we can now convert procedurally generated instances into objects and collections with the new Visual Geometry to Objects operator, which lives in the Apply menu. It doesn't replace the active object, but creates new ones from its evaluated geometry. And that is all the geometry node newness in Blender 4.5. And it was all made with geometry nodes. Now it's over to Wayne, who's going to talk about animation.
Thanks, Harry. It's Wayne here from CG Cookie to talk about all the animation and the rigging updates for Blender 4.5. To summarize, my picks would be, there's a bunch of snapping updates, which are very helpful, shape keys, thank you, and bone displays. But you can see all of them there. Let's get stuck in. In pose mode, there are extra options in the select grouped menu. You can now select children, that's all of the children, immediate children, that's only one generation, as well as parents or siblings. So now you can play happy families just like you can in edit mode. Although don't use the menu like a dork, just press Shift G like you're the favourite child. It's now possible to snap the playhead in any editor that has a timeline. That is the graph editor, the dope sheet, the timeline itself, the NLA, and the video sequence editor. Here I am in the dope sheet. You can see I've got some keyframes and some markers, and there is a new option here called playhead. This is the playhead snapping. It is different to the keyframe snapping, which is right next to it. But when I open this up, you can see we can snap to frames, seconds, markers, keyframes, or strips. You can select multiple options by holding down the Shift key. So here I have markers, keyframes, and strips active. Now strips is only active in the video sequence editor or the NLA. To activate it, just start scrubbing and then hold down the Control key. And you'll see it snaps to the markers there, or it snaps to the keyframes. You can also change the snap distance. When you enable the Use Snapping checkbox, Playbox snapping will now be turned on by default, and then when you hold Control, it's going to toggle it off. And one more thing with the frames and seconds options, these ones actually give you extra values here. You can change the step value, and that's going to change the value that it's going to snap to. So if I set frames to 4 and seconds to 1, when I activate the snapping, it's going to snap to every 4th frame or every second. There's just 2 caveats with this. With the normal timeline, the snapping will actually work. However, because it has the minimalistic view, you can't actually see that menu option there. So you need to set it in one of the other editors, and then it will work as expected in the normal timeline. And our video sequence editor already had snapping, but all of the old snapping that already existed in the video sequence editor has now moved to these new functions. That's worth mentioning if you're doing any Python scripting. The inbuilt add-on, Copy Global Transform, now supports keying sets. So if you have a keying set active as well as auto keying, and you enable only active keying set, when you copy and paste the transforms, this add-on will now correctly use the keying set. When you use the keying set menu by pressing K in the viewport, the available keying set is now always there, even if there isn't any existing animation data. This change means it's now possible to set a hotkey for this or use it in a key map because it's always present. You still need to use this properly though, because if you try and use this keying set without any animation channels already existing, Blender is going to call you an idiot in a way that makes you think like it's having an error. It's user error. But of course, if there's already animation channels available, when you use this keying set, it's going to work as expected. So that part hasn't changed. As of Blender 4.5, you can now override the display mode of any single bone. Over in the viewport display for each bone, there is a new setting called Display As. This is where you can override that display. This opens up a world of visibilities. Okay, well maybe 4 or 5 if you include the custom shapes. But either way, that's pretty cool. The snapping in the driver's editor has now been separated from the snapping in the other editors. This means you won't need to toggle your settings on and off when you're working with drivers. Excellent. There have been 2 excellent additions to shape keys. There's now a really simple duplicate shape key option, which will duplicate the active shape key. This saves so many steps of disabling the ones that you don't want, turning on the ones that you do, and then applying a new shape as a mix and then renaming it. Why didn't this exist a million years ago is a mystery, but thank you, Hans Gaudi. The other addition for shape keys is the update from objects operator. This is very similar to join as shapes, but it will update any of the existing shape keys with the incoming data. And it's called update from objects with the S because you can update more than one shape at a time. This is going to drastically speed up your shape key workflow. Thanks again, Hans. And the final thing I want to mention is an API change with a graph editor operator. Graph.keyframeJump has now been replaced with screen.keyframeJump. The new one supports all the same functionality, and the same operator can now be used in many different editors. So if you're using the old one in any of your scripts or your add-ons, you'll need to update that. So there we go. That is the update for the animation and the rigging in Blender 4.5. Those shape key changes are going to save so much time. Thank you, developers. All right, now on to Paul to talk about Grease Pencil.
Grease Pencil 3.0 dropped in Blender 4.3, one version after the last long-term support release. Since then, the improvements have largely been on backwards compatibility, bug fixing, and getting Grease Pencil to integrate with Blender's other features such as geometry nodes and modifiers. The big addition in this version is the Grease Pencil render pass. This can be enabled in the View Layer Properties editor under Passes, Data, and ticking the Grease Pencil tick box. If the Grease Pencil object is obscured by other mesh objects in the scene, this will have an effect on its alpha, so that you can isolate that pass later in the Compositor for its own effects. This may not seem like much, but a new supersampling method for rendering has been added, and can be controlled in your Render Properties editor under the Grease Pencil panel. This will give you independent control over the sampling rates for viewport shading and rendering, where viewport will use the traditional sub-pixel method to anti-alias the result, but supersampling will take over at render time. Increasing the supersampling anti-alias samples will produce a more aesthetically pleasing result when mixing Grease Pencil objects into your scenes. Now, clamping of minimum thickness for fine lines has been removed, and this might cause some issues with opening files created in an earlier version of Blender. But just by increasing the supersampling anti-alias samples a little, it will correct this so that the strokes will render right. Modifiers could be isolated to individual layers. They now support groups. This gives you greater control on which layers are included or omitted from a Grease Pencil modifier. Fill guides are what we're calling boundary strokes now. When you're using the Fill tool, you can hold down Alt and left-click and drag a line to close any gaps before creating a fill. There's also a new option in the Fill tool, under Advanced, which will automatically remove these fill guides after you produce your fill. While we're talking about time-saving tips, masking with layer above or below is now an option in your Add Extras dropdown. Set Curve Type is being replaced by a Convert Curve Type operator. Now, the legacy version is still present, but it's going to be hidden in your Strokes menu, mainly for backward compatibility. Some small operators from 4.2 that had been removed in 4.3 are back. The Split operator. In edit mode, you can select a number of points, then hit Shift-V to split them off. the outline stroke option is now reintroduced. This is a fun way of taking very basic strokes and turning them into outlines that you can later fill. Most of the other stuff is a load of under-the-hood improvements to the Python API, and if you want to see what they are, you can always go to the developer release notes for a detailed look. Now, back to Jonathan.
Light objects got a surprising and solid upgrade in Blender 4.5, and now have a control for color temperature. There's also a new exposure slider to change their strength in a more user-friendly way, and a normalize option that keeps their total output the same regardless of their size. The watts unit was removed from the power since it was referring to the output watts but kept getting confused with the input watts that light bulbs have listed on their package, but those are drastically different and not necessarily correlated at all. Both Cycles and EEVEE got a new volume shader called Volume Coefficients, which allows for easily inputting real-world data to get physically accurate absorption, scattering, and emission. When it comes to exporting images and movies, auto-detecting color spaces was improved, ProRes videos can now be written, OpenEXR can now read and write ACES metadata, BMP images can now have an alpha channel, the FFV1 video codec can now render to 10, 12, or 16 bits, and rendered images can now store pixel density metadata, such as pixels per inch or non-square pixels. And now for the Cycles and EEVEE specific updates, let's hear from an incredible artist and an incredible scholar.
Hey everyone, Gleb from Creative Shrimp here. I'm super excited to walk you through some fantastic new features in EEVEE and the viewport rendering in Blender 4.5. In the object settings, you will find the new normal and geometry offset sliders to control Shadow Terminator. These are super handy for squashing these annoying self-shadowing artifacts you sometimes get on low-poly geometry. By just tweaking these offsets, you can really dial in those low-poly shadows and get them looking perfect. In past versions of Blender, if you placed the camera super far away and then zoomed in, you'd often run into Z-fighting, especially in those huge landscape scenes that stretched for miles. Blender 4.5 fixes that with a new reverse Z algorithm, which is way more robust for extreme scales. Even if you're not planning to render objects millions meters long, I think it should make you a little happier knowing that now you can totally do that. We've also got some bug fixing, a shadow acne fix using quantized geometric normal, and a nice little fix for light leaking in some scenes. Next up, we've got some sweet performance upgrades. At the end of the day, it really depends on your specific scene, but the combo of this new threaded optimization and the texture loading performance boost is a big step up. In most cases, you'll get to that all systems go moment way faster than before. The improvement can be pretty drastic in certain scenes. Needless to say, the texture loading boost is especially handy for scenes that are loaded with textures. I thought I would mention it. However, depending on the scene, it might be just marginally faster to compile shaders and all that, but still an improvement, and the one that doesn't require us to do anything specific on our end. And now for a neat quality of life upgrade concerning navigation and selection. In earlier versions, semi-transparent objects would still interfere with the depth-based selection, even when you didn't want them to. With 4.5, objects that aren't marked as selectable simply won't interfere with selection or auto-depth anymore. And then the big news, Vulkan is here! Chances are you've already heard about this popular display backend, and now it's officially supported in Blender. It isn't the default just yet. To enable it, simply head over to your preferences, then go to the System tab and turn it on from there. Just don't forget to restart Blender afterwards. So to put it briefly, Vulkan makes Blender run noticeably faster in more ways than one. You'll see a faster cold start, more responsive vertex selection and general mesh editing, especially on dense meshes, and even sculpting gets a boost. Plus, displaying those really large scenes with heavy poly counts in the viewport will be much smoother. Here's a 41 million polygon scene running at 60 plus FPS on my machine. And finally, Blender now supports GPU subdivision on both Metal and Vulkan. What this means for you is significantly better performance, even when you're working with those really high subdivision levels. Where was I? Yeah, so smoother workflows all around.
Hey everyone, this is Károly Zsolnai Fehér here from 2 Minute Papers, and I'm excited to share what's new with Blender's excellent built-in path tracing render engine, Cycles. Adaptive subdivision, which allows you to dice up meshes depending on how close they are to the camera and therefore achieve efficient displacement with ultra-realistic detail, has been an experimental feature in Blender for years. And in Blender 4.5, it has received a huge upgrade. It now properly subdivides attributes, smooths the UVs, and supports motion blur. It's also significantly more performant due to multithreading and other optimizations, making it 10 to 15 times faster to render. Normal mapping also helps to achieve realistic detail when polygon counts need to be kept lower. In Blender 4.5, the bump filtering of normal maps was improved to preserve more detail near the edge of shadows. The bump map node was also improved. A new filter width input can be used to control how sharp or smooth the transitions between large height differences are. The default distance was also reduced to a value that makes much more sense for adding small details to realistically sized scenes. Cycles can also now use custom scripted cameras using open shading language. This allows for recreating gorgeous real-world camera lenses without introducing more noise to the scene. Camera OSL does not need shader OSL to be enabled and does not have the same limitations, though it is currently limited to CPU or optics GPU rendering. Lastly, AMD devices now use AMD's HIP ray tracing hardware acceleration by default, which can improve render times on newer AMD GPUs by up to 30%.
Hi, AD Boris here from Creative Shrimp. Let's dive into some of the compositor changes in Blender 4.5. The first thing you might notice in the compositor, at least once the use nodes is enabled, of course, is that the default node tree now contains a viewer node right from the start. The little top right icon there will refresh things, so if you toggle one of the full screen modes and then change some stuff, you might notice that when you toggle back, that those changes aren't immediately shown in the viewer. So just hit that little refresh icon or Control-Shift-Click on the node or socket again, and that should update the results. In previous versions of Blender, if you tried to copy, for example, the mix node from the compositor and then paste that into the geometry nodes editor or the shading nodes editor, then you're going to be met with a very negative attitude. Now though, in 4.5, there's much more of a can-do attitude. Not only is there a whole bunch of new nodes in the compositor, but these useful common nodes are now compatible and can be copied and pasted between the editors. In the compositor add menu, we'll see a new texture section, as now the compositor has access to all these texture types. And similarly, as demonstrated with the other recently added nodes, these can also be copied and pasted around between those node editors. A new image info node was added to provide information like the dimensions of the input image. Here I'll drag this 2048 image into the compositor, right-clicking to sample the results of the viewer node in the image editor, and we'll see 2048 is confirmed there. If I add a scale node and scale that then by half, the dimensions are now going to be 1024. But Control-Shift-Clicking on the resolution node so we can hook that up, and we'll see that the actual original output is 2048. And as you can see, we've got a few more outputs here of other general image transformations. So the scale output shows up that, yep, this image has indeed been scaled by 0.5. There's a new image coordinates node, which gives us a uniform coordinates output with 0, 0 right in the center there. Negative values to the bottom left, which is why that all looks dark. And then positive values to the upper right in a uniform linear distribution in both axes. So no matter the aspect ratio, the textures using these shouldn't look stretched. The normalized output removes any negative values and goes from 0, 0 in the bottom left corner to 1, 1 at the top right. So that's going to make textures look more stretched if, like in this example, the aspect ratio of the image isn't square. The pixel output just outputs the position of that pixel, so 1, 1 for the bottom left, and then in this example 15% of the resolution, so 960 by 336 is going to be in the top right. With just a few nodes, we can get a reasonable vignette effect, so that darkening at the edges. Here, notice how the uniform coordinates output a perfect circle, while the normalized coordinates probably give us something a bit more useful to use as a vignette. With a few more nodes, we can easily turn it into a node group with some handy sliders to change the look of it a little bit. And if I use it with an image that has a different aspect ratio, so in this case just use a simple square image, the vignette effect should adjust to it perfectly fine, thanks to those normalized coordinates. Here's another good one for maintaining consistency, the new relative to pixel node. For example, if you need to keep a consistent size of blur independent of image sizes, here I've got an image at 256 by 256, for example, and the same image underneath it at 2048. I've also got a blur node that is set to a size of 256, which of course is going to obliterate the 256 sized image. It's just too small. But let's say we like how it looks with the bigger image. We want both to look like they get basically about that same amount of blur. Well, 256 is an eighth of 2048, so we can put that into the relative to pixel value, which is 0.125 in other words. So when we plug that in, we shouldn't see a change there. But now, thanks to this node, if we plug the smaller resolution image in, it should still look like it's blurring the equivalent amount, keeping its smaller resolution in mind, instead of blurring it into oblivion. Next up, there's a tweak to the glare node. To make things a little bit clearer, there's now a clamp checkbox that was added to enable and disable the clamping highlights. There's always something, keeping an eye on the little details somewhere. In a similar fashion, we'll notice that booleans are now a supported socket type, giving us a little checkbox on the vignette group node there, for example. Also, lots of nodes now have socket inputs. Here's the bokeh image node as an example. Interpolation options were added to the scale, corner pin, and map range nodes. The denoise node now supports being used with the GPU. In the backdrop of the compositor, we now have some gizmos for the box and ellipse mask nodes, giving us a way more intuitive way to move, rotate, and scale them into position. A backdrop gizmo was also added for the split node. In the image editor, there's a new overlay for the render region to visualize the render size a bit easier compared to whatever the image is that you might be viewing at that time. The mix color node can now clamp both the factor and the result, and the vector curves node has gained a new factor input. Of course, there's always more, and a ton of things were actually removed too, as you can see here. These are mostly to clean things up, as they either didn't make any noticeable changes or their functionality can be performed with other nodes. For example, the map range and clamp nodes can basically do the same as the previous map value node. Anyways, that should wrap up this peek in on the compositor section.
Blender, being the jack of all trades that it is continuing to also make strides in the video editing department. In Blender 4.5, videos that have been rotated by their metadata play back significantly faster, and just all regular videos play back a little bit faster. The slip operator was completely refactored and is now smooth and precise while also giving more info in the header and status bar. And when slipping, any keyframes on the strips also move along with their contents. The blade tool for slicing clips now has its own custom cursor. Adjusting strip handles now affects all of the selected strips, and if you lock a channel, the time adjustments for those strips also gets locked. You can now snap strips to the start and end frames, and snapping is enabled by default. And the 2D cursor can now be snapped in the preview area. Ctrl-M can now be used in the preview area to mirror on the X or Y axis, and H and Alt-H can now be used to hide and unhide. You can also now move the anchor point of a strip without moving the image. The preview area now supports HDR footage, just like the 3D view and image editor. Resizing the timeline now reveals more channels instead of stretching the existing ones. Scene strips now update more reliably and no longer have to have their caches cleared. If you import a strip to a blank timeline and it updates the frame rate, you now get a warning in the status bar. A few things did also get removed in this release, such as the ability to have a backdrop behind the strips, the old cache system, and some of the older effects that were already replaced by newer effects. In the asset browser, you can now take a screenshot of Blender for an asset preview so that you can easily get a nice rendered shot. And as long as the whole capture is within the 3D view, the background will be transparent. You can hold Shift to toggle between a square and non-square preview, or use space to move it around. Also, the Generate Preview or Remove Preview options now work on all selected assets. Labels are now drawn with up to 2 lines, and the spacing has been improved a bit. You can now choose to display your assets as a horizontal list, which is great for browsing less visual things like geometry node setups. The import method for assets has been moved to a new Import Settings popover. This is also where you can find the option to disable importing collections as instances if you want them to show up as editable geometry right away. Dragging and dropping collections into the 3D view now snaps them to surfaces or the grid just like objects. And lastly, tooltips for assets are nicer and include more information. When it comes to importing and exporting files, you can now import and export PLY, OBJ, STL, VDB, CSV, and TXT files using geometry nodes like Harry mentioned earlier. Dragging and dropping from the file browser now works on all selected items and not just the active one. Importing USD now supports animated camera properties, skeleton rest poses, new shape primitives, prim variables, and more dome lights. Exporting USD now supports text objects, the Material X OpenPBR surface, prim variables, and the experimental point instancing option can now work with geometry node instances. With GLTF, you can now import scenes as collections, decide whether or not to import unused materials, and choose whether or not to merge duplicate material slots. For exporting, there are new options for vertex colors, saving the workbench viewport material, and using the ambient occlusion color as a base color. GLTF also works great with Blender's new light temperature and exposure settings. When exporting, FBX can now write proper smoothing groups in addition to normals and sharp edges. The importer for FBX has been completely rewritten in C++, and this new version is marked as experimental, but it's 3 to 15 times faster and uses less memory. ASCII files and binary files older than 7.1 are both supported now, and there are a ton of improvements, including but not limited to better handling of rotation in object hierarchies, better handling of material parameters, better importing of leaf bones, importing layered animations, and importing animated diffuse colors. For OBJ, it better exports smoothing groups. And lastly, the SVG importer can now handle multiple files at once.
Hi, it's Harry again. Before Jonathan talks about changes to the user interface, I want to talk about the changes that affect all of the nodes in Blender 4.5. First, there's been some changes in the way frames work, where the keyboard shortcut F now frames selected nodes and automatically opens the rename menu. F's old functionality has been passed on to J, who said he didn't mind, but you can tell he did. F is also now the key to press if we want to create an empty frame. And we can also use F to detach a moving node from a frame now, or to attach an unattached one to the frame under the cursor. When creating frames within frames, their color now alternates, making nested frames much easier to work with. And yes, this works with custom colors too. You can add an empty group in all three editors now. Internal links show on muted nodes, regardless of whether or not their outputs are linked. The socket selection lists now show icons for each type of socket. And we can now create new group input nodes by dragging inputs from the sidebar. You know vectors? Well, they've had a bit of a glow up. There's now a dimension property where you can adjust your D to 2, 3, or 4. And they can now have percentage or factor subtypes. I'm going to put this vector to use so I can show you that panels now have toggles. With a panel selected, toggles are now an option in the menu. They allow us to create more user-friendly node groups where the panels can be turned off. Now we can search for nodes by specific operation. And we can search for the scene time node using the words seconds or frame. And finally, I'm going to leave you with a warning. A noodle warning. Because link errors now appear on the link as a dread red triangle of doom. Back to Jonathan.
As always, there are a lot of miscellaneous improvements to the user interface that are really starting to add up over time. First up, using a pen tablet with Blender is now a bit nicer. There's a highlight when dragging regions and areas to let you know when you've grabbed it. And the hitbox for corners and area borders are a bit bigger. You can also customize that area border size. Tooltips show up even if your pen jiggles a little bit, and they stay put so that you can read them. Selecting tools with a pen will no longer sometimes accidentally bring up the tool alternatives. Hitboxes for gizmo parts are now a bit larger too. And as mentioned before, Blender can now read pen tilt, and the way that it reads it is consistent with other apps. In the 3D view, Cavity was moved to its own section at the bottom of the shading panel, and the panel overall got a small facelift. If you have a mouse with a sideways scroll or a secondary scroll wheel, it can now be used to pan the 3D view, or any other editor. In the overlays, you can now see the axes in orthographic view even if you turn off the grid. In the sidebar, you can now use number pad period to jump to the current tab if you have a lot of add-ons enabled. Selection menu titles and status bar hints are now a bit more specific. It's news to me that you can click and drag on the toolbar and sidebar region arrows rather than just click on them, but that's been improved. The scroll bar for left-aligned regions like the toolbar are now on the left, so you won't accidentally grab them while trying to resize. The layout of search boxes is now pixel perfect. Custom 2D gizmos can now use custom icons. In the timeline, the markers region no longer conflicts with the scrubbing region when compressed. Scroll bars with handles now shrink when your mouse is not near them, just like regular scroll bars, and scroll bars are hidden in the NLA editor if it's really small. Over in the properties, individual tabs can now be hidden in the options dropdown. And you can no longer drag to hide this region, which, let's be honest, generally happened by accident. But if you want to do that on purpose, you can now do it in the context menu. The new presets icon makes you feel more like a DJ. The collection visibility panel was reorganized a bit. You can now remove all materials from an object in one click in the options dropdown. You could already hold Control and scroll while hovering over numbers to increment or decrement, but now you can also do the same thing over text fields, though it doesn't change anything after a period, so I wouldn't use it for renaming duplicated objects or anything complex, but it's a nice touch. The default height of nested lists was increased, the extra padding on the right was removed, you can now drag and drop to the end of the list, and they have improved scrolling behavior. In the outliner, you can now see grease pencil vertex groups as well as action slots. In the spreadsheet editor, domains that are empty are now grayed out. You can also now manually adjust column order and width, and double-clicking on a column edge makes it fit the content. In the View menu, you can now display internal attributes such as whether or not a component is selected. And the context path for the viewer was moved to the left to make room for more header menus in the future. The status bar had its spacing tightened again, so more hotkeys can be visible at once. Hints for a few more operations are now shown, including when editing text and soloing in the VSE. There are new icons for trackpad gestures, and the page up, page down, and hyper icons have been improved. The RGB channel icons are now colored red, green, and, you guessed it, blue. The color for warnings and errors across the app can now be themed. The icons on alerts are now less extreme. Improved line breaks mean less long tooltips and more readable file paths. When loading new windows, the background color is now the theme title bar color. And I know this is what you've all been waiting for. The light theme got a couple of improvements, from better text for hidden items in the outliner to improved scroll bar handles. On Linux, Wayland, and X11, CRISPR cursors are now shown on high DPI monitors, and the hyper modifier key is now supported. On Mac, the busy but clickable cursor is now used during long operations, and you can now use the Option plus arrow keys to jump words, or Command plus the arrows to move to the start or end when editing text. And on Windows, the startup background no longer flashes white, and dragging and dropping files is now more reliable. And that, along with hundreds of bug fixes, is what's new in Blender 4.5. You can download it today from blender.org, and don't forget to support the development fund while you're there to help make future updates even better. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Jonathan Lampel from cgcookie.com. Have a great rest of your day, and happy blending.